It was a harsh winter morning, colder than usual, even for our remote forest reserve. Snow fell gently, blanketing everything in pristine white, hiding any sign of life beneath its deceptive beauty. I had started my daily patrol early, my breath forming little clouds in the icy air, the crunch of snow beneath my boots the only sound breaking the eerie silence. Suddenly, my peaceful walk was shattered by frantic sounds. Instinctively, I froze, straining my ears. The noises were unmistakably animal cries, sharp, desperate, filled with terror. My pulse quickened, and adrenaline surged through my veins as I moved cautiously toward the source. Pushing through the frosted branches, my heart nearly stopped. Right in front of me, less than 50 yards away, two tiny bear cubs were cornered against a snowy embankment by a pack of wolves. There were 5 wolves in total, lean and aggressive, their fur bristling, eyes glinting with the ruthless hunger of a harsh winter. The cubs, small and vulnerable, shrieked in panic. Their cries echoed through the forest, a piercing sound that cut deep into my soul. Every fiber of my being screamed to intervene, to save these defenseless creatures. But my logic wrestled fiercely with instinct. The wolves were not only desperate, they were dangerously unpredictable. Approaching could cost me my life. Paralyzed by fear and torn by indecision, I watched helplessly as the wolves advanced. One lunged suddenly, snapping viciously, narrowly missing the smaller cub. The little bear stumbled backward, whimpering in distress. The larger cub tried to shield its sibling, growling weakly, displaying remarkable bravery despite its tiny size. "Run!" I whispered urgently, though I knew they couldn't hear me. "Run, damn it!" As if hearing my desperate plea, the cubs bolted abruptly towards the frozen river nearby. Their clumsy paws skidded across the icy surface, slipping but determined to escape. The wolves hesitated briefly at the edge of the ice, wary of the dangerous, slippery terrain. I exhaled sharply, relieved for a fleeting second. Yet I knew their struggle was far from over. The frozen river was treacherous, capable of breaking at any moment beneath their fragile bodies. And as the cubs scrambled forward desperately, the wolves regrouped, preparing to pursue. My heart pounded violently. All I could do was watch as the cubs raced toward uncertainty, each step taking them deeper into danger. The next morning, I woke early, haunted by yesterday's scenes. Sleep had been nearly impossible, and the image of those 2 tiny cubs fighting for their lives kept flashing through my mind. Without eating breakfast, I dressed quickly, grabbing my gear and heading straight back toward the riverbank, driven by the need to know what had happened. The forest was unusually quiet again, the fresh snow covering yesterday's chaos in a deceptive layer of calm. But the silence didn't fool me. My gut twisted as I approached the scene from the previous day. The once pristine snow was marred by chaos, tracks interwoven in a violent dance, streaks of frozen blood dark against the pure white. I knelt down, running my fingers over the icy crust, piecing together fragments of the struggle. The bear cub's small, frantic paw prints were easily distinguishable from the larger, more aggressive tracks of the wolves. My breath caught painfully as I followed the crimson smears. There was no doubt about it, one or both of the cubs had been injured. A chill deeper than winter's bite settled into my bones. Stepping carefully, I followed the bloody trail, heart heavy with dread. The tracks led me toward a dense cluster of snow-covered bushes. As I approached, something strange caught my attention. A clump of fur partially buried in the snow. I carefully brushed the snow away with trembling hands. It was bear fur, soft and dark, slightly frozen with blood. "Oh no!" I whispered under my breath, feeling a sharp pang of guilt and sadness. I couldn't help but wonder if I could have done something, anything, to change the outcome. Lost in grim thoughts, I suddenly heard a faint rustling sound behind me, sharp enough to snap me from my melancholy. My pulse quickened instantly, senses sharpening as adrenaline surged again. I turned cautiously, scanning the dense underbrush, every muscle tense. There it was again, a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but definitely there, within the thick cluster of bushes. I squinted, holding my breath, my heart thundering loudly in my chest. For a brief second, a shadow shifted among the branches, elusive and unclear. "Who's there?" I called out instinctively, realizing only afterward how ridiculous it was to speak to the wilderness. Silence answered me, cold and indifferent. Yet, deep within that silence lay something living, something watching me from the shadows. And whatever it was, I knew our encounter was far from over. Holding my breath, I approached the bushes cautiously, my heart pounding relentlessly. As I gently parted the branches, my breath caught sharply in my throat. There, shivering and huddled tightly into a tiny, miserable ball, lay one of the bear cubs. It looked up at me weakly, dark eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. A deep, painful-looking gash marked its side, crusted with blood and snow. The little creature trembled violently, clearly hypothermic. In that instant, my hesitation vanished completely. Carefully, I removed my thick jacket, gently wrapping the fragile cub inside, feeling its faint warmth and fragile heartbeat against my chest. "Hang on, little one," I whispered, hurrying back through the dense, snowy woods toward home. Each step felt like an eternity, my urgency growing with every weakening shudder of the cub pressed close to my body. Arriving home, I burst through the door, startling my wife, Elena, who dropped the firewood she just collected, eyes wide with shock. "Ivan, what is it?" she asked, rushing toward me. I carefully revealed the cub cradled in my jacket. "We need to help him. He's badly hurt." Without a word, Elena immediately sprang into action, quickly preparing warm blankets near the fireplace. Together, we gently laid the cub down, cleaning its wound carefully, and dressing it as best we could with what limited supplies we had. Hours passed, tense and exhausting. Elena quietly brewed herbal tea, her eyes frequently returning to the tiny, vulnerable form curled up by our hearth. I sat silently nearby, unable to take my gaze away, consumed by worry and an unexpected tenderness toward the little creature now fighting desperately for survival. Night fell swiftly, the shadows deepening the already tense atmosphere in our small home. The wind outside picked up, howling like a ghostly presence against our walls. Suddenly, another sound echoed clearly above the wind. A distant, unmistakable chorus of wolves, their haunting cries slicing sharply through the darkness. Elena froze, her eyes wide and fearful. "They're close," she whispered, glancing anxiously toward the window. "They know he's here," I murmured softly, a cold realization settling deep inside me. The cub stirred weakly, as if sensing the threat outside. The wolves continued their mournful, chilling song, each note driving home the stark reality of our situation. We weren't just saving a helpless animal. We had invited danger directly to our doorstep, a danger now lurking just beyond the darkness, waiting patiently for its moment. Darkness enveloped our cabin completely, the wind outside howling with relentless fury. The warmth of the fireplace offered little comfort as the haunting chorus of wolves grew louder, closer. Elena sat near the bear cub, gently stroking its fur, her fingers trembling slightly as anxiety tightened her features. I stood at the window, peering into the blackness beyond, my heart thudding painfully. The pack had gathered around our home, their shapes barely visible in the moonlit snow, their eyes glinting menacingly. It was clear they weren't leaving anytime soon. "Ivan, what are we going to do?" Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Stay calm," I replied quietly, forcing confidence into my tone. I moved toward the door, grabbing my rifle, feeling its cold metal reassuring in my grip. But deep down, I hoped I wouldn't have to use it. A low growl reverberated outside, quickly joined by others, forming an unsettling symphony of aggression. I opened the door slightly, stepping cautiously onto the porch. Immediately, cold air bit sharply at my skin. The wolves stood silently now, alert and tense, their breath misting in the frigid air, eyes reflecting the faint light. "Get out of here," I shouted fiercely, waving my arms, hoping my loud, threatening voice would scare them away. But the wolves held their ground eerily calm, staring straight at me with chilling defiance. My chest tightened painfully. This wasn't typical behavior. These wolves were driven by something stronger, deeper. Suddenly, a small, dark shape caught my attention at the edge of the pack, moving uncertainly. My breath caught sharply, my eyes widening in disbelief. It was the second cub, alive and seemingly unharmed, but oddly calm among the wolves, as though it belonged with them. Impossible! I breathed, disbelief overwhelming me. Elena stepped out cautiously behind me, clutching her shawl tightly against the cold. Ivan, is that? Yes, I confirmed softly, eyes locked on the small cub. It was moving hesitantly among the wolves, as if confused, yet somehow accepted by them. This bizarre scene only heightened the tension, making it clear that the situation was far more complicated than I'd imagined. As I stood there, rifle lowered, frozen by astonishment and uncertainty, the wolves took one collective step closer, tightening the noose around our small home. The cub among them raised its head slightly, its dark eyes briefly meeting mine. A silent, enigmatic plea, challenging everything I knew about the natural world. The wolves continued to linger around our cabin until dawn, their shadowy figures blending with the morning mist before finally retreating into the forest. Exhausted from the tense night, I stood silently by the window, deeply troubled. The image of the cub peacefully moving among wolves haunted me relentlessly. How had it come to trust those predators? And more importantly, what was my role now? Elena gently approached me, sensing my turmoil. Ivan, what does it mean? She asked softly, her eyes reflecting deep concern. It means we've stumbled into something complicated, I murmured, glancing back at the injured cub sleeping peacefully by the fireplace. Nature is playing by rules we don't fully understand. Throughout the day, I couldn't shake my uneasy feelings. I observed our little guest closely, noticing its fragile innocence, utterly helpless. Yet, somewhere out there was its sibling, seemingly safe among those ruthless wolves. Felt fundamentally wrong, yet oddly reassuring. Nature had offered the cub an unlikely protection, one we couldn't provide. Later that afternoon, bundled against the piercing cold, I stepped outside to clear my thoughts. Fresh wolf tracks surrounded our cabin, mixing eerily with smaller paw prints, the second cub's traces blending seamlessly among them. The realization hit me hard. The cub had truly accepted the wolves as its family. Is this nature's mercy or cruelty? I whispered to the wind, my breath forming misty clouds that quickly vanished into nothingness. A deep, internal conflict gnawed at me relentlessly. Should I intervene, forcefully reunite the cubs, risking further violence? Or should I let the wild decide their fate? The injured cub whined softly inside the house, breaking my reverie. I knew deep down I couldn't ignore the bond these creatures shared. They were family, torn apart by brutal circumstance but destined to find each other again. My decision crystallized painfully clear. Despite the risks, I had to bring the cubs back together. Returning indoors, I met Elena's questioning gaze. We must reunite them, I declared firmly, my voice steady despite the uncertainty racing through my veins. Are you sure, Ivan? She whispered, anxiety etched clearly on her face. No, I admitted honestly, but we owe them a chance. As night approached, my resolve hardened. Tomorrow, I would venture into the unknown, risking everything to give these siblings another chance, despite the wolves, despite my fears, because sometimes family demanded the greatest sacrifices. Early the next morning, a heavy sense of purpose pressed upon me as I prepared for what might be the riskiest journey of my life. I carefully wrapped the recovering cub in thick blankets, gently placing it into a sturdy, padded backpack. Elena watched me silently, worry clear in her eyes, but she trusted my judgment. Be careful, Ivan, she whispered, gripping my arm tightly. I nodded solemnly, forcing a reassuring smile. I'll return soon. Everything will be fine, I promised, though my heart beat wildly with uncertainty. Stepping outside, the biting winter air immediately pierced my clothes, reminding me of nature's relentless harshness. The forest felt unusually quiet as I moved toward the area where I'd last seen the wolves. Every step felt heavier than the last, each crunch of snow beneath my boots amplifying my anxiety. Eventually, I reached the clearing where wolf tracks mingled with smaller bear paw prints, evidence of their recent presence. Carefully, I set the backpack down, gently removing the cub, who squirmed slightly in confusion. Its eyes looked up at me trustingly, tearing at my resolve. "You have to go back to your sibling?" I murmured softly, placing the cub onto the snow. It shivered, sniffing the air nervously, sensing its surroundings. Moments later, a chilling howl echoed through the trees, startling both of us. My pulse quickened. This was it. From the shadows emerged the wolves, slowly surrounding us. Leading them was a large alpha female, her gaze intense and calculating. Her eyes locked onto mine, conveying a clear message of dominance and authority. I stood perfectly still, breath held, heart thundering painfully in my chest. The alpha moved closer, her steps cautious but unhesitating. She stopped mere feet away, inspecting the cub, then returning her penetrating gaze to me. Time seemed to halt completely as we sized each other up, both understanding the delicate balance of power at play. Unexpectedly, the alpha stepped forward gently, lowering her snout to sniff the cub. The little bear whimpered but didn't retreat, seeming strangely calm under her examination. Astonishingly, the alpha's posture softened, her stance shifting from aggressive to protective. The other wolves relaxed visibly, mirroring her acceptance. I stood frozen in awe and disbelief, realizing I had witnessed something extraordinary. A fierce predator showing mercy and acceptance toward its natural prey. Nature had once again defied my expectations, leaving me profoundly humbled and deeply moved. In the following weeks, I found myself returning often to that clearing, compelled to witness the unusual family that had formed against all odds. From a safe distance, concealed behind dense bushes and trees, I observed the wolves and the bear cubs closely, meticulously documenting every fascinating detail in my notebook. The pack had truly adopted the injured cub, treating it with surprising gentleness. I watched in awe as the alpha female tended carefully to the cub's wound, licking it clean and nudging it gently whenever it stumbled. The cub adapted rapidly, quickly learning to interpret wolf signals and behaviors. Its sibling seemed equally comfortable, confidently playing alongside its new wolf brothers and sisters, their interactions filled with a strange but undeniable bond. Despite the heartwarming scenes, I struggled internally. Was I right to allow this unusual relationship to continue? Had my interference disrupted nature's balance? Or was this harmony simply nature finding its own path? Each day brought more questions, leaving my thoughts tangled and uncertain. Elena listened patiently each evening as I shared my observations and doubts. Her eyes always reflected a thoughtful understanding, yet offered no easy answers. "Nature knows best," she reminded me gently one evening. "Perhaps this is exactly how it's meant to be." Gradually, the cubs began growing noticeably larger, their playful antics evolving into more assertive, bear-like behaviors. The pack's dynamics subtly shifted, adjusting to accommodate these growing creatures. The wolves occasionally showed signs of frustration or confusion, particularly when the cubs displayed behaviors foreign to wolf instincts, climbing trees or aggressively wrestling beyond the pack's norms. One cold afternoon, as I observed quietly, hidden beneath the thick branches of a towering spruce, I saw a clear moment of tension within the pack. The larger bear cub challenged one of the younger wolves over a scrap of food, emitting a deep, rumbling growl that was undeniably bear-like, powerful and dominant. The wolf hesitated, backing down uncertainly, clearly confused by this unfamiliar assertion of dominance. I scribbled furiously in my notebook, noting the shift. This was significant. Bear instincts were beginning to override the learned wolf behaviors, causing noticeable ripples within their delicate harmony. It was both fascinating and concerning. How long could this unusual family maintain their fragile peace? My pen paused over the page, a sinking feeling gripping me as I realized that their peaceful coexistence was hanging by a thin thread, destined to unravel sooner or later. As weeks turned into months, I continued my observations, deeply immersed in the unfolding drama within the wolf pack. The bear cubs were no longer small or easily manageable. They had grown significantly, and with their size came the inevitable clash of instincts that threatened the harmony of their unusual family. The pack's hunting patterns became disrupted as the bears grew larger, needing more food than the wolves typically required. Disputes over prey grew increasingly common, and subtle tensions were quickly turning into outright confrontations. The bear's natural inclination for solitary dominance clashed sharply with the wolves' structured hierarchy, causing visible confusion and irritation among the pack members. One bitterly cold morning, while observing from my usual hidden vantage point, I witnessed a particularly aggressive confrontation. The larger bear cub, now almost fully grown, attempted to seize prey from one of the younger wolves. The wolf resisted fiercely, snarling and snapping in defiance. Within moments, the situation escalated drastically, drawing the attention of the entire pack. The alpha female intervened, attempting to assert her dominance, but the bear responded aggressively, roaring defiantly and standing tall on its hind legs, dwarfing her significantly. The wolves backed off instinctively, visibly shaken by this display of raw power and defiance. I watched, heart heavy with the realization that the fragile unity I'd marveled at was fracturing irreparably. Nature was reclaiming its course, forcing these two different species back toward their inherent roles and instincts. As tensions within the pack continued to mount, another pressing concern loomed. The sky darkened ominously, heavy clouds gathering rapidly on the horizon, bringing with them the unmistakable scent of an approaching snowstorm. The temperature dropped sharply, biting into my exposed skin with ruthless efficiency. I knew the coming storm would severely test the survival skills of all creatures, especially this divided family. Anxiety churned within me as I packed my gear quickly, retreating toward my cabin, desperate to prepare for the brutal weather ahead. Glancing back one final time, I saw the pack dispersing uneasily, each member instinctively sensing the impending storm. The bears lingered uncertainly on the edges of the clearing, isolated and confused, symbolizing the inevitable separation that had begun. As snowflakes began to fall heavily, whipped by strengthening winds, I couldn't help but wonder, would this powerful storm sever the final threads of their extraordinary bond, or could they withstand nature's fury together? The storm hit with brutal force, wind howling viciously through the trees, snow swirling violently, blinding everything in a thick, white haze. Inside the cabin, Elena and I huddled close to the fire, anxiously awaiting the storm's passage, both unable to stop thinking about the creatures outside, exposed to nature's merciless wrath. Hours dragged on endlessly, each minute intensifying my restless anxiety. The harsh conditions outside mirrored the tension I knew was boiling within the wolf pack. Unable to bear the suspense any longer, I finally stood, reaching for my coat. "Ivan, it's too dangerous," Elena protested, gripping my arm. "I need to see," I replied, determination firm in my voice. "I have to know they're all right." Stepping outside, the cold immediately stole my breath, snowflakes stinging my face like tiny needles. Visibility was nearly zero, and every step forward was a battle against the fierce winds. Struggling onward, driven by a deep, unshakable urgency, I slowly made my way to the familiar clearing. What I saw next froze me to the bone, colder than the storm raging around me. The wolves and bears faced off in the swirling snow, tension thick and deadly. The larger bear cub had fully asserted itself, roaring defiantly at the alpha wolf, who bristled aggressively, unwilling to yield control. The pack circled anxiously, tension escalating by the second. A sudden lunge by the alpha triggered chaos. Wolves lunged forward, snapping and growling furiously, while the bears reared up fiercely, defending themselves with powerful swipes. The brutal battle unfolded rapidly, obscured by relentless snow, yet the sounds of conflict cut sharply through the storm, terrifying and heartbreaking. I stood helplessly, paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of grief and powerlessness. This was nature's harsh reality, brutal and unforgiving, unfolding violently before my eyes. I desperately wanted to intervene, to shout, to stop them, but deep inside, I knew it was pointless. Nature had reclaimed control. As the violent winds tore relentlessly around us, the fighting intensified. My vision blurred by tears and snow, I struggled to see clearly, unable to discern who was winning. The cries and snarls echoed hauntingly through the storm, a chaotic soundtrack of desperation and survival. Suddenly, a piercing roar filled the air, cutting sharply through the storm's fury, silencing everything. And then utter stillness. I stood frozen, heart hammering painfully in my chest, blinded by the relentless snow, uncertain of who had emerged victorious, and who had fallen victim to the savage reality of survival. As dawn broke the following morning, the storm had finally eased, leaving behind a silent, ghostly landscape. Fresh snow blanketed the forest, erasing almost all signs of life beneath its flawless surface. Unable to rest, I dressed warmly and stepped outside, compelled by a heavy sense of dread and curiosity to witness the aftermath firsthand. The cold air was crisp and sharp, biting at my skin as I trudged through the deep snow, each step sinking softly, unsettlingly quiet. My heart tightened with anxiety as I approached the clearing, the site of the fierce confrontation from last night. My pulse quickened when I saw the scene laid bare in front of me. Snow churned up violently, clear evidence of the brutal struggle. Tufts of fur scattered haphazardly across the white expanse, both wolf and bear. Dark crimson droplets speckled the snow, stark and vivid against the pure white backdrop. Slowly, I moved through the battlefield, carefully examining the tracks. It was impossible to determine clearly who had triumphed and who had fallen. Wolf tracks and bear paw prints overlapped chaotically, telling a story of chaos and desperation. I traced the tracks carefully, trying to reconstruct the event, but the story remained frustratingly incomplete. My chest tightened painfully as I saw the tracks leading away from the clearing. One set heavier, deeper than the others. Were these made by the bears? Had they survived? Or was this merely the wolves retreating victorious? Nature keeps her secrets well, I murmured quietly, my breath misting in the crisp air, disappearing like the answers I desperately sought. Elena approached slowly from behind, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Ivan, perhaps some things we're not meant to know," she said gently, her voice tinged with sadness but also wisdom. I nodded silently, her words resonating deeply. As I stood there, surrounded by the silent echoes of survival and loss, I realized something profound. My desperate need for answers had overshadowed the simple, powerful truths nature had shown me. Resilience, adaptability, and the fierce will to survive. Walking slowly back home, Elena's hand clasped warmly in mine, I glanced one final time at the clearing. The snow would soon erase these tracks too, hiding forever the truth of what had happened here. Yet, in my heart, I knew the memory of this extraordinary family would remain forever. And perhaps that was the only answer nature intended for us, one shrouded in mystery, left for us to ponder long after the footprints had faded.